Hello, Dennis. Glad to see you healthy and safe, considering everything that is going on in New York. Dennis, you were Attorney General of New York State, and you are probably well familiar with Governor Andrew Cuomo. As we all know, New York State was the epicenter of coronavirus epidemic, but now the situation seems to have stabilized, and New York has become a safer state. Does Governor Cuomo deserve credit for this?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, Dimitri, and it's a pleasure to be with you. It's always an honor to join you and your viewers. And thanks for being such a gracious host when I join you. I wish that I was in Israel so we could be doing this on the set together, but unfortunately, during this pandemic, this is the second best way for us to get together. So the situation in New York is somewhat unique in my view, because it has been the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, which is somewhat curious because other large states such as California, Illinois, where there's large cities, the numbers haven't compared to the numbers that we see here in New York. For instance, the number of deaths across the United States are just a little bit more than 125,000, but yet 31,000 of those deaths, or about 25%, are right here in New York State. So, while New York is not the most populous state in the nation, it's third or fourth now behind California, Florida, Texas. It leads the nation in the number of reported cases, and unfortunately, in the number of reported deaths. As far as the governor is concerned, I think that ultimately it will be left to history to determine whether or not his policies were effective. Mostly because you have to weigh the number of cases that I've just cited, the number of deaths, but you also have to take into account the economic harm that has been brought to bear as a result of his policies to close things down. And while we are reopening in phases across New York State, for instance, in New York City, there's still a long way to go. So New York is a challenging state. I think the governor has done as good a job as he can, but the effectiveness of it really won't be, the effectiveness of his policies won't be determined for some time, in my estimation.
Recently, we saw that Mayor de Blasio of New York City allowed Black Lives Matter protesters got violate social distancing rules. But the same Mayor de Blasio would not allow religious Jews to congregate and conduct weddings and funerals. Please tell us, from the U.S. legal perspective, is Mayor de Blasio discriminating against the Jewish community? Is he allowed to permit one group to congregate while not permitting other?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It raises, I believe, the conduct of Mayor de Blasio, and frankly, the conduct of Governor Cuomo, and elected officials across the United States, raise serious constitutional issues, in my estimation. And this is foremost in my mind. When I was in elective office, when I was the Attorney General of New York State, I knew those communities in Brooklyn and Williamsburg, Borough Park. I knew those religious communities very well. I was very concerned about their issues then, and I remain concerned about their issues now. There's a city councilman, Kelman Yeager, who is now a city councilman, who 25 years ago was an aide on my staff. So he helped me to better understand, issues in these neighborhoods, which were populated by a lot of religious Jewish families. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution was purposely drafted as the First Amendment. So our founding fathers, when they created this great nation of ours and the blueprint of how the government would work, as they turned to the amendments to the Constitution, which were designed to reflect on how the government should interact with the people, there's a reason why religious freedom was the First Amendment. Um, and it's also, was a reason back in the 1700s why freedom of association and freedom of speech were combined, were joined together with the freedom of religion. Because when you think about it, they are intertwined. Your ability to assemble, your ability to speak about your religious issues, and your ability to worship as you choose are all covered by the First Amendment. So when an executive, whether it's the mayor of the city of New York or the governor of the state of New York or any other state, begins to unilaterally, without legislative authority other than just a broad grant of power, starting to restrict religious freedoms, I think that Constitution is being violated. Now, I'm not going to be in a position where I'm going to compare, the protesters, de Blasio not limiting the protest while limiting religious gatherings, because I think just limiting the religious gatherings, standing alone, if there was no comparison, there was no counterbalance of the protesters, I think that the restriction on religious liberty, standing alone, violates the United States Constitution.
Dennis, I've mentioned earlier that you were the Attorney General of New York State, and prior to that you also served as Chief Federal Prosecutor for the Western District of New York. You had spent decades in law enforcement before going into private practice, which is why I want to ask you, did you ever see the kind of disturbances that we have seen in the United States over the last months? From here in Israel, when we watch TV, it seems like a loss of control. Can you comment, please?
Well, Dimitri, I could understand why you and your viewers have that impression, because information is so available through the internet. I mean, here we are, today I'm speaking to you 7,000 miles away. You're in Israel and I'm in Buffalo, New York. So, the internet in many ways has shrunk the world and made information more available. Unfortunately, because I know you and I know that you're a young man with a young family, I know that you're several years younger than I am. And my colleague, Jan Przanski, is also several years younger than I am. So what you might not remember, and maybe what many of your viewers don't recall, is that in 1968, we had in the United States a similar type of turmoil. And I was, I wasn't yet voting age in 1968, but I was old enough to pay attention to understand. In 1968, think about what was going on in 1968. You had all of the protests on college campuses across the United States in opposition to the Vietnam War or the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. In April of 1968, you had arguably the most well-known and most recognized and most adored civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, was assassinated in April of 1968. You had the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, decide that he wasn't going to run for re-election in March of 1968. That led to Bobby Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, to enter the presidential race, and then he was assassinated in June of 1968. So by time those events all came together, America was ablaze. Cities were being burned. Uncontrolled riots and protests in the streets. College campuses were being overrun by students who were in opposition to the war. It was a very grim time. It was a very grim time at that point in time of our national history. It led, arguably, to the election of President Nixon, to Richard Nixon as the president of the United States. But what's happened since 1968 is America has truly blossomed. I mean, the 20th century truly was an American century. And a lot of the accomplishments of the United States, including landing on the moon, that happened a year after all of these riots. So we've picked ourselves up before as a nation. As grim as these protests are, as grim as the COVID crisis is and the unemployment, the protests in the streets, America is a resilient country. And America is built on people who are forward-looking and not backward-looking, which is why I think we will overcome this.
Dennis Vacco, thank you for being with us today.